How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we studying Daf Samach Tes, Daf 69 of Masechta Menachos. Friends, I must apologize. It is Friday afternoon. Shabbos is starting soon. I'm running back and forth from the bomb shelter all day. Unfortunately I just did not get to learn the daf as well as I would have liked. I'm sure it'll be fine, but we don't have slides today, and I would have liked to spend a little bit more time. There's some good sugyas, there's some important sugyas here. It is a little bit of a grab bag daf. There's a lot of tekus, a lot of technical stuff, but I would have liked to be able to sit with it a little bit more. But akoponim azoy gaitis, this is the Metzias over here in Eretz Yisrael. It's givaldig, everything's great. Yeah, I've been to the bomb shelter a lot since midnight, before midnight even. Yeah, I was there. I think I was there before I recorded this morning's daf. I was there just now, probably within an hour ago. I think I was there before that as well. Yeah, I've been a lot of missiles, a lot of missiles. So hopefully we won't have one now while I'm recording, because I'm not planning to go because I need to get this done. So yeah, hoping for the best. Fingers crossed. Anyways, where are we? Okay. We are on Daf Samach Tes of Masechta Menachos, second line of the Daf. Rami Bar Chome asks a kasha, Shtei Alechem Hanotza Sharia o Chanota Sharia. Interestingly, apparently there is a halacha that I did not know about. We're going to learn about it in about 2 weeks, I think. That when it comes, so the bikurim, if I understand, you see, this is maybe an example of something I would have liked to look up a little bit better. But alas, I was learning this section of the daf in the bomb shelter, and I didn't have time, or actually, I guess it's here, so I could have technically looked it up. But anyways, I was learning this in the bomb shelter this morning. And anyways, apparently there is a halacha that when it comes to bikurim, I assume we're talking about the bikurim that are brought on Shavuos, the first fruits, they have to have reached a certain point of growth before the Shtei Alechem, interestingly. Right? So the Shtei Alechem is really just for the Chadash in the Beis HaMikdash, and Chadash is really just the 5 grains: wheat, barley, spelt, oat, and rye. However, there is a separate halacha, apparently, that when you bring first fruits, you're going to want to bring your first fruits that at the time that the Shtei Alechem was offered on Shavuos, they had already reached a certain point of growth. And the question is, what is that point of growth? But Rami Bar Chome asks, Shtei Alechem Hanotza Sharia o Chanota Sharia. In terms of the first fruits, I assume that we're talking about all the first fruits, unless you're just talking about wheat and. It could be that we're just talking about wheat and barley of the first fruits, but I assume we're talking about all the first fruits. Does Rashi say anything? I don't think so. Rashi doesn't say much on this. Is there maybe a letter that I missed there? No. I'm going to assume that we're talking about all the first fruits. So that's the Shiva Saminim. But I think we're going to get there in about 2 weeks. So let's just hold that thought. But Chanota Sharia, so Hanotza Sharia or Chanota Sharia, basically at which point of the growth of the fruit, at what point of the fruit's growth does it have to have reached by the time of that the Shtei Alechem is offered? Is it Hanotza, which is just like, I guess, it's apparently an earlier stage of the fruit kind of budding and sprouting, or Chanota, which is also early, I think, but a little bit further along. So my Hanotza, my Chanota. So now the Gemara wants to know, when we say Hanotza and Chanota, what exactly do we mean? Ilema Hanotza de pair of Chanota de pair. Are we talking about, like I was saying, the fruit, when the Hanotza of the fruit and the Chanota of the fruit, kind of these early stages in the development of the fruit? Hashta Hashrosha Sharia Hanotza v'Chanota mibaya. We know that when it comes to we're going to learn in a Mishnah on tomorrow's daf, on Daf Ayin, that the halacha is that when it comes to the 5 grains, when it comes to the Chameshes Minei Dagon, in terms of Chadash, The halacha is that if it was hashrasha, if it took root, let alone have fruits, that's going to come later on. But even if it just takes root before the omer is offered, so then already it's acceptable. So when it comes to the chameshes mine dagon, even just taking root is enough. So then certainly if we're talking about stages of already developing fruit, there's nothing to talk about. Of course that's enough. Ela hanotza de olive, hanotza de olive. Rather, it's talking about the leaves. Rather, it's talking about not the fruits that comes later, but the leaves. These earlier stages in the leaves. Mihave ki hashrasha ola. Would these stages of the leaves be like hashrasha or not? Teku, we say it is a tie. By Rav asks. By Rav bar Rav Chonin. Rav bar Rav Chonin asks. Chitin shezron bekarka. When it comes to wheat that has been planted in the earth, wheat that has been planted in the earth, that has been planted in the earth. Omer matirin or ein omer matirin? Does the korban omer, is it matir the wheat or not? If you planted wheat, you offer the korban omer. Is it going to be matir this wheat or not? Says the Gemara. What do you mean? Hechidami. What are we talking about? Either ashrush tanina, the lo ashrush tanina. Understand? As I said a minute ago, there's a Mishnah, Ditnan, that we're learning a Mishnah on tomorrow's daf, on daf Ayin Amud Aleph. Im ishrishu kodem laomer, omer matirin, vim lav asurin, ad sheyavo omer abo. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. If the wheat has already taken root prior to the minchas omer being offered, so then the minchas omer is matirin. If it has not yet taken root, well then this year's minchas omer is not matir. Next year's minchas omer will be matir it. So I don't really understand what your question is about. If you plant wheat, if the omer is going to be matir it. I mean, did it take root or not? I mean, we know the answer to that question. Why is Rav bar Rav Chonin asking this question if it's a Mishnah? Lotzricha dichatzdinu v'zarinu kodem laomer. Rather, what it's talking about is that you had, if I understand correctly, you had some grain, you had like some wheat or something, and you had stalks of wheat, and they were on track to be permitted by the Omer. It took root, and I think we're going to see later on that also you have to harvest them. We're going to see later on about reaching a third of its growth. The way I understood that also, I was in a rush. Again, everything today has a little bit of a caveat. I was in a rush, so everything's like, I hope I understood correctly. But I think that there are two things at play over here. One is that by the time the Omer comes, the grain has to have taken root in order for the Omer to be matir. That being said, in order for it to be, I guess, considered like food or whatever, you would have to harvest it when it's at least a third of its growth. Okay, so why am I even saying this? Oh, because I don't know why I'm saying. Wait, let's. No, I think it's important because I think in order for it to be considered like actual food, that would be. No, actually, maybe I don't know why I'm saying that. Let's just look at the Gemara again. Where are we? Right. So basically, you have this wheat that already took root before the Omer. At the very least, it took root before the Omer, and then you uprooted it. So it was on track, Batsim, to be mutter, to be permitted by the Omer. It had already taken root. You then uprooted it, and you take its kernels or whatever, and you plant them in the ground. So the question is, do we view them as food? In which case, right, you basically took them and planted the ground. What if now you then dig them up after the Omer? You dig them up, and you decide that you want to eat them. So now what? Do we say that, well, they had already reached a third, they'd already been rooted, and they were, the Omer came, and as food, right? When they were planted, right, and they were already taking root before the Omer was going to come. They were on track to be permitted by the Omer. What'd you do? You uprooted them, you took them and you replanted them. So do we say, now you collect them after the Omer? So do we say, well, the Omer was matzah them, you could eat them. Or do we say, well, you replanted them. And now these kernels, as seeds, they hadn't yet taken root. And therefore, basically, you had uprooted them before the Omer, replanted them. When the Omer came, there were seeds in the ground that hadn't yet taken root. So therefore you can't eat them. That you uprooted them and then you planted the kernels before the Omer. And now the Omer came, and when the Omer came, they were planted in the ground and they hadn't yet taken root. So now what? Can you eat them now? Can we treat them as if you took them and put them in a container, in which case the Omer came and was matir them, you can eat them? Or do we say, since you planted them in the ground, they're now just considered like seeds that were planted in the ground and had not yet taken root, and no, you can't eat them. Another question. Yesh len ono, o ein len ono. See, I wish I could have spent a little bit more time with this, but this, of course, is a amazing sugya from Masechta Bava Metzia, Perek Azov, that ono, the concept of overpaying or underpaying, so that does not apply to property. That does not apply to real estate, to land. So therefore, these seeds that have been planted in the ground, do we treat them like food, like metalton, or do we treat them like earth? And they're right. And the question is, as metalton, as seeds, they would have ono. As earth, they would not be shaykh to ono. So echidami, how so? Ilem do omerle shadoi ba shiso. V'asu. I'm sorry. So if we say shadoi ba shiso, so if it's talking about where the seller said to the buyer that I put 6 cores, right? I planted 6 cores of wheat in the ground. And witnesses came and said he only had put 5 in the ground, which means that he had been dishonest by a 6th. Rava says, regardless of if it's metaltlin or karka, anything that could be measured or weighed or counted, even if it's less than onah, right? Normally by onah, if it's within a 6th, so the stale would be valid if it's within a 6th of the value. Now, but when it comes to an amount, for example, if I say that I'm selling you, 10 pieces of fish, and I sell you 9 pieces of fish, so the difference between 9 and 10 is less than a 6th, but nonetheless, I told you I'm selling you 10 pieces of fish, I only gave you 9. So in that case, it's not a matter of onah, it's a matter of you said you were going to do something and you didn't do it, right? Onah is more when it comes to value, right? So if I say I'm gonna, right? So for example, so let's go weiter. For example, el da'amarle shadoi ba ki deboi lo. Rather, it's talking about where the seller said to the buyer, I planted a field's worth of seeds. And therefore a field's worth is not a specific amount, but it's a certain value, right? That it's a field's worth of seeds. Where then witnesses come and say, no, you didn't properly seed it. So you're not really getting what the amount of, right, that you don't think that you're getting the value that you thought that you were getting. So the question is, yesh len ono, do we say that there is ono? Tichman, tishaja, bechad adamyo. V'yesh len ono. Do we say that there's ono because it's metalflin? It's just considered like you took these wheat kernels and you put them in a container. It happens to be you put them in the ground, but it's a kilo, you put them in a container and they're metalflin. And ono is shaykh. Otilma, patul lagabi ara, or do we treat them like the ground itself? And therefore there is no ono because there's no ono by karka. And finally, nishbayin aleinu and nishbayin aleinu. Also, when it comes to shvua, right, we don't swear about karka, about land. So again, And do we treat them like you just put them in a container and they're metaltlin and you would swear about them? I don't know exactly what you'd be swearing about, but maybe somebody gave them to watch or something. I don't know. Or maybe they're bottled to the ground. And they're like the ground. And therefore we don't swear on them. Teku. It's a tie. Asks, Chitin shebigale bakar v'sarin shebigale behema. If there are whole kernels of wheat or of barley in animal dung, in cattle or animal dung, mau, what about them? Lemai, what about them? Ilem le tamuye tumas ochlin. Well, maybe the question is, can they become tamri tumas ochlin? These wheat and barley kernels in the animal dung. Well, Tanina, we have a brisa, Tosefta, that says, well, chite shebrei bakar, wheat kernels that are in the dung of cattle, v'sarin shebeglale behema, and barley kernels that are in the dung of other kinds of animals. Chishev alein la'achila, ein mitame tumas ochlin. So if they are still in the dung and they are not very foody, they are more dungy than foody. So then, even if you have some kind of machshava that they should be food, doesn't make a difference, and it's not going to be considered food. And if a dead cherry touches them, they won't become tamei with tumas ochlin. Likton, if you gathered up these wheat and barley kernels, la'achila, with the intention of eating them, well, then they do. They're no longer dungy. They're foody. And mitame tumas ochlin, they would be mitame tumas ochlin at that point. So, like, what's the question here about the wheat and barley kernels? Kilu, we know the answer. It depends what you do. If they're still in the dung, then they don't become tummy. If they're taken out of the dung, then they can become tummy. If you intend to eat them, they can be tumas ochlin. Ella li menachos, rather for menachos. Pshita lo akiveu no lefechasecha yitzcha yisapanecha. Can you use this wheat for a korban mincha? Obviously not. Obviously not. Hakiveu no lefechasecha, the pasuk says in Sefer Malachi. Bring it to your governor. Hayitzcha yisapanecha. See how he'd appreciate that. Bring him some dung wheat. Lo tzricha dinaktinu v'zarinu. The shayla is if you took that wheat and you planted it. And then out from that wheat or that barley grew wheat and barley crops. And now you want to bring the crop as menachos. Minayu, from them. What's that? Is the issue is that when they're all dungy, they're all grossy. So therefore, you can't bring them as a mincha in that state. However, once you plant them in the ground and from it grows a new plant, what's wrong with that new plant? That's fine. You could bring a mincha from that. Odilma, or perhaps mishum kishusahu, or maybe though, since it has already been digested by the animal, it spent time in the digestive system of the animal, it got weaker, and it's not going to be a good product. It's weak, and it's not going to be a high quality flour for korban mincha. Teku, it's a tie. But you remember, Bachama asks, Pil shebola kfifa mitzris ve'kia derech beisarei. If you have an elephant that swallowed some kind of a basket made out of like fibers of a palm tree. Sorry that I feel terrible. I'm just like reading the daf, but that's where we're at. My apologies. I didn't have time to. I just ran out of time. My apologies. I didn't get to learn this daf or prepare it or give it all. There's such great stuff on this daf. It's very technical. There's a lot of tekus and stuff, but it deserves proper attention. So my apologies to you. My apologies to the daf. But remember, pil shabala kfifa mitzvahs. So if you have a elephant and it swallowed up a basket made out of some kind of palm tree fibers, the kia derech beis arei, and then it basically excreted it, but it was whole. Can you imagine? The basket came out whole. Mao, lemai, what's the halacha? What are we asking about? Well, if you're saying that, well, if it was tummy before the elephant ate it, will it still be tummy? Of course it'll still be tummy. Tanina, we learned in a Mishnah, I believe, yeah. That the only way for a kli in order to no longer be tameh is by a shinu maisa. You have to make a change to it. Here there's no change to it. Well, it's talking about where what happened was the elephant swallowed up these fibers, not a basket, but swallowed up the fibers, digested the fibers, excremented the fibers, and then a person took those fibers and made it into a basket. The question is, normally if you would take these fibers and not feed it through an animal, but if you just take these fibers and make a basket of it, the basket would be makabel tumah, because the fibers, a basket made out of these fibers would be makabel tumah. But the question is, a basket made of dung, a clay galolim, right, a vessel made of dung, is not makabel tumah. So the question is, do we treat these fibers that have been through the digestive system of the animal as fibers, and the vessel, the basket that you make it from it would be mikabel tumah, or do we treat it as dung, in which case the vessel, the basket you make from it would not be makabel tumah? Friends, what do you think? That it swallowed these fibers, digested it, and came out the other end, and was then used to make a basket. Miava equal, do we say, well, it's considered like they've been digested, do we say, well, since they've been through the digestive tract of the animal, so we treat it like clay galolim, dung vessels, and they are not makabel tumah, they makabel tumah. Domamai, because we say clay avolim. This is a mishnah as well, a mishnah in Kalim. Clay avonim, the clay galolim, the clay adama, vessels made out of stone, dung, earth, ein makabel tumah, are not makabel tumah. Lo midivei Torah, lo midivei sofrim, not midorais, not midorabanan. Or dilma, perhaps lo have equal. And maybe we say it's not considered like, we don't say it's considered like dung. It's considered rather like these palm fibers, and the vessel would be makabel tumah. Tifshot lei meha. Let us attempt to answer from the following. The Amar Ula says, Ula mishum Reb Shimon ben Yotzadok. Maise, there was a maase. Uvalu zevim shnei tinokis bevar yarden. That in Avar Yarden, wolves swallowed up 2 babies and excremented them out whole. And the shaila is, would these babies be mitame tumasames? They came out whole. The Chacham said that since the animals, even though they came out whole, but they went to the digestive system of the wolves, so therefore their flesh would not be mitame tumasames. But we say shiny basar dirokich. We say, yeah, but maybe flesh is different because it's soft, and since it went through the digestive system, we say it's not considered like meat that would be matame anymore. But here we're talking about fibers. Okay, so v'lifshet mi seifa. Okay, but then it continues, the timu es ha'atzamos, that they said that the bones nonetheless were tameh. Okay, so meaning even though the bones of the babies went through the wolves, they retained their tumah of the bones. So the bones remain tameh. So maybe let's say, therefore, okay, so if we're saying that the meat was too soft and the fibers of the palm tree are harder than that, well, the bones retain their tumah. So maybe then the palm fibers should retain their integrity, and it should be a proper vessel. Shani atzamos the akushet tfei. Yeah, but bones are particularly tough, and maybe that is why they retained their tumah. But maybe the palm fibers are not as tough, and maybe they would be considered like clay galal. But Reb Zera wants to know, chitin sheyardu ba'ovim ma'u. What happens if wheat somehow gets into the clouds and it starts raining, and along with the rain comes down wheat? Limai, what are we talking about? Ilim Menachos, if we're asking if you can use this wheat that rains down from the clouds for a korban mincha, amai lo, why can't you use it? Ela l'shtei alechem, rather for the shtei alechem, mai, what do we say? Mimosh v'seichem, by the shtei alechem it says mimosh v'seichem, from your households, amar achmana la'afuke de chutzlaretz, to exclude chutzlaretz, so from where you live in Eretz Yisrael, to the exclusion of chutz la'aretz, that we don't bring the shtei lechem from chutz la'aretz. Dilo, avol the ovim shaper dami, but maybe wheat that is rained down from the clouds could be okay. Or perhaps davka va'afilu the ovim namilo, or maybe we're saying specifically from your households to the exclusion also of wheat that rains down from the clouds. Is there such a thing as wheat that rains down from the clouds? And there is. The adi tayo, like adi the Arab, nechisa le rum kizba chite bitlosa parsa. He had a field that was 3 parsos by 3 parsos, and a very thick layer of wheat kernels came down in rain. By Reb Shimon ben Pazi Shibolis Shevia Shlish Kodem LaOmer. Okay, V'akra. Right, so here's the thing. This is what I was talking about earlier. So it says Reb Shimon ben Pazi, if you have a stalk, and the stalk, of course, took root before the Omer, but not only did it take root, but it also reached a third of its growth before the Omer. Okay, the Akara, and he uprooted it. The Shasla la'achar Omer. So what happened was you had this, let's say, wheat, or shiboles. I don't know, what is that? Is that just a stalk of wheat? I don't know, some kind of stalk. Let's say wheat. I hope I'm right. So you had a shibola shual, I think is oat, but shibolas I think is probably just a stalk of wheat. So if you have a stalk of wheat, so before the Omer, not only did it reach a third, not only did it take root, but also reached a third of its growth. It was properly grown before the Omer, and you uprooted it. And then after the Omer, you then replanted it, which means that the state that it was in at the time of the Omer became mutter by the Omer. The Omer was offered, and now this wheat that you had harvested already is now going to be mutter to eat. Ve'osifa, and then what happens is, so then it says v'shasta la'achar Omer. After the Omer was offered, you then put it back in the ground to keep growing. Ve'osifa, and now it added more wheat grew onto it. So the question is, what's the status of this new wheat? Do we say basar ikra azlinan? Visharye Omer. Do we say, well, all the new wheat, right? Meaning at the time, you had uprooted the stalk before, you had uprooted the wheat before the Omer. At the time you uprooted the wheat, it had already it not only did it take root, it reached a third of its growth. So it was a proper stalk. And this is what I was getting into before and kind of confused myself. But meaning, because if it hadn't yet reached a third, okay, so then, meaning if you would have kept it in the ground, yeah, I think that's what I was getting at. Anyways, in order for the Omer to be matir a stalk, it has to have been taken root before the Omer. It doesn't have to have reached a third of its growth before the Omer, but as long as it's taken root, then you just leave it in the ground, and whenever it's ripe, and you harvest it at that time. But as long as it had taken root by the time of the Omer, you'd be able to eat it right away. Now, the thing is, if it had taken root before the Omer, but you uprooted it before the Omer, so at the time that the Omer came, you had already uprooted the stalk. And the stalk at that time that you uprooted it wasn't yet a third of its growth, so then it's not considered like food that would become mutter. And therefore, if you plant it again after the Omer, there isn't anything to say that like any stuff that grows, it's not like there was any part of it that was mutter at the time of the Omer. But if it had already reached a third of its growth, the Omer came and was matir what was already, the stalk at that point, and now after the Omer, you replant it and it grows more. So the question is, this new growth, can it kind of feed off the back of the growth in the third of the growth before the Omer, which was made mutter by the Omer, and therefore all subsequent growth will also be mutter, just like the initial growth? Or do we say that the new growth came after the Omer and you're going to have to wait for next year's Omer? What does Rashi say? It's considered that it's completely fruited. If you uproot it before that, will just be like grass. And the Omer would not permit it, since at the time the Omer was already uprooted and it wasn't a third of its growth yet. So the Omer wouldn't have permitted it at all. But it had reached a third, and the Omer did permit it, and now you replanted it. Right, so and now it continued to grow more wheat. Do we say all of the subsequent growth is, kind of piggybacks on the initial growth, which was permitted by the Omer, and all subsequent growth is also going to be permitted. Or maybe we say we go based on the additional growth that's considered separate post Omer, and you're going to have to wait for the next Omer for the subsequent growth. Let's answer from what Abba says in the name of Yochanan. If you have a young orla branch, right? So you have a tree and it's orla. It's within the first 3 years. What you do is you take this branch, though, that has fruit on it, and you graft it into a tree that is more than 3 years old. Right? And you stick it into an older tree, uva paris, and there are fruits on this branch. Even if the fruits on the branch that was grafted into the older tree, even if those fruits expanded and now they're 200 times the size of the initial, 200 parts to 1, the size of the initial amount of orla, and 200 to 1 is mevatel orla. So when you took that branch initially and stuck it into the older tree, it had fruits. Those fruits were orla, but then the fruits continued to grow, and now they're more, right? They're 200 parts of new growth to 100 part of initial orla growth. Nonetheless, they're also because they go based on the initial state. From Rabbi Shmuel ben Nachmani, Rabbi Yonasan, Botzel sheshesolo bekerim. If you take a onion and you plant it in a vineyard, and therefore it's kilayim, vinekar kerim, but then the vineyard was uprooted, but nonetheless, at that point it was kilayim. So afilu osid b'masayim, even if it now becomes 200 times the amount, 200 parts of subsequent growth, non-kilayim growth, to 1 part of initial kilayim, nonetheless, it becomes asur because it maintains its initial state. So therefore, we should say, based on the situation by orla and kilayim, that it retains its initial state, and therefore, by the chadash, by this wheat stalk that was uprooted but then replanted after the omer, all subsequent growth should go based on its initial state, and it should be permitted. And so the Gemara Yegufa kami barle, but that's pumped what he's asking, what Rishon ben Pazi is asking. Mifshad poshet lu l'rabbanan the bas ikra azlinan loshna l'kulav loshna l'chumra. Is it that it's just that's what the rabbis told, that we always go based on the initial state, no matter whether it's l'chumra, like we said by orla, that we have to, it's always going to be orla, once orla, always orla, or like kilayim, once kilayim, always kilayim. So we're being machmir to say that it's always going to be asur, right? And whether we're being asur, or in this case, we would be saying that it's mutter if we go based on the initial state. Since the initial state, the third when the stalk was the third, it became mutter by the omer. So even the subsequent growth is also going to be mutter, just like the initial growth. So do we say that that the rabbis understand it like that it just always goes based on the initial state, whether that initial state was kosher, like by the omer, or whether it was possible, like by orla and the kilayim? Or maybe they're simply unsure, and they say they're just being machmir, right? That when it comes to the orla, when it comes to kilei karim, we say that we have to go based on the initial state. We say that it's asur just because we're not sure, so we have to assume that it's asur. But in the case of the omer, we'd also be unsure. We'd have to say the subsequent growth is also asur. We wouldn't just say that it's based on the initial state and that it's mutter. Teku, it's a tie. Friends, that was Daf Samach Tes, Daf 69 of Masechta Menachos. Sheesh. Yeah. Again, I feel a little bit bad. There was a lot of stuff on this daf. Yeah, basically, the way I presented it was basically just a grab bag. We got through it. There were interesting sugyas. I can't really tell you what they are, but okay. Hopefully, we'll come back to them on our journey through Shas. But okay, at least it's in our souls somewhere. Cheva, have a great and quiet Shabbos.